Long before humanity measured time in centuries and kings, a true titan roamed the plains of Ice Age Asia. It wasn't a dinosaur, nor was it a mammoth. It was something bigger, heavier, and arguably more majestic. Palaeoloxodon namadicus, a name you've probably never heard, but one that should echo through the ages. This colossal elephant didn't just roam the plains of Ice Age Asia, it owned them. Standing taller than a two-story house and weighing more than a herd of modern elephants combined, it was the largest land mammal to ever walk the earth. And yes, that includes the mighty T-Rex. So why don't we talk about it? How did this giant vanish from history? And what terrifying truths are hidden in the bones it left behind? This is the story of the forgotten king of the Ice Age. The real titan. How big was Palaeoloxodon namadicus? Really? We thought the African elephant was the biggest ground animal that had ever lived for many years. The woolly mammoth then showed up, but neither of them could compare to Palaeoloxodon namadicus, a dead Pleistocene monster that may have been the biggest of all the titans. Still, most people haven't heard of it. Palaeoloxodon namadicus wasn't just big, it was colossal. Some fossil estimates suggest it reached shoulder heights of over 5 meters, more than 16 feet. That's taller than a giraffe, and weighed up to 22 tons, almost double the weight of the largest African elephants alive today. That kind of mass puts it on par with some medium-sized sauropod dinosaurs. The long-necked legends of the Mesozoic. In the world of mammals, that's unheard of. What made it even more impressive was the way its size was distributed. This wasn't a creature with a long tail or extended neck to pad the scale. Its body was solid, dense with muscle, bone, and mass. Its legs were like tree trunks, built to bear unimaginable weight, and its torso was massive and deep, supporting lungs, a powerful heart, and some of the longest tusks in the animal kingdom. Fossils of P. namadicus have mostly been found in India, particularly in the Narmada Valley, which was once a vast savanna teeming with prehistoric life. But remains have also been found in other parts of South Asia, including Pakistan and possibly even Myanmar. This giant didn't just exist. It roamed, leaving footprints across ancient riverbeds and floodplains, shaping its world simply by moving through it. As a result of a partial femur bone being one of the biggest pieces known, experts now know that land mammals could be much bigger than they thought. The femur was over 1.5 meters long, which is almost 5 feet, and thicker than most grown human torsos. It was made to hold the body and move slowly, deliberately, and without stopping. Picture an animal that is as big and heavy as a small building, but has the quiet dignity of an elephant. The implications of its size go far beyond just record-breaking. Palaeoloxodon's bulk affected everything: its metabolism, its environment, its social structures, even how it gave birth. To support that much mass, it had to consume enormous quantities of vegetation daily, probably hundreds of pounds of leaves, bark, and grasses. Its digestive system had to be incredibly efficient, and its range had to be vast because no small patch of forest or field could support a creature that size for long. It was nice to be big, though. Once Palaeoloxodon became an adult, it was probably safe from most animals that wanted to eat it. Hyenas, saber-toothed cats, and even big alligators would not have attacked a fully grown Palaeoloxodon. It was impossible to touch just because it was so big, a living fortress of bone and meat. And yet, despite its size, it's largely absent from public consciousness. It doesn't get the same spotlight as mammoths or mastodons, and it's rarely mentioned in documentaries or museum displays. That's partly because many of its fossils are fragmentary, and some of the best specimens have only recently been properly analyzed. But the more we study them, the clearer it becomes. Palaeoloxodon namadicus may have been the undisputed heavyweight champion of land mammals. It brings up some interesting questions about development. Why did something so huge grow in the first place? What kinds of places let it happen? What happened that finally made it go away? There are more fossils to find that will help us figure these things out, but one thing is already clear. This was no ordinary elephant. But being the biggest isn't just about height and weight. It's about how every part of the body had to evolve under that crushing mass. And nowhere was that more apparent than in its skull. Skull of steel. Why its massive head redefined elephant evolution. A lot of the time, when we think of ancient giants, we picture huge bodies with thick skin and huge arms. But Palaeoloxodon namadicus was one of the most beautiful old animals at showing this power, especially when it came to its head. Not only was its head big, but it was also a biomechanical wonder that pushed the edges of what a mammalian brain could hold up. And that totally changed how we think about how elephants evolved. Palaeoloxodon's skull wasn't just proportionally big, it was colossally oversized, stretching over 1.5 meters, nearly 5 feet, in length in some specimens. And it wasn't simply elongated, it was densely packed, thickened and reinforced, especially in the region between the eyes. That area, called the parietal and frontal bones, formed a massive dome-like structure, bulging upward into a sort of bony crest. This dome served a vital function. It acted as a shock absorber, helping support the enormous tusks, some over 4 meters long, that projected forward from the skull. The weight of those tusks alone was enough to destabilize the average elephant skull. But in Palaeoloxodon, the skull adapted, grew denser, and evolved to carry and balance that burden like it was nothing. This thickened dome may also have been used for intraspecies combat, similar to the headbutting behavior we see in modern-day animals like musk oxen or bighorn sheep. Two Palaeoloxodon bulls might have squared off, clashing headfirst in powerful shoves for dominance. And this wasn't just hypothetical. The reinforced structure of the skull is strikingly similar to what we see in animals that use their heads as weapons. Imagine two 20-ton animals slamming their heads together like battering rams, and the sound of each hit could be heard across the Ice Age grassland. In order to escape those hits, the skull would have had to be built with some of the strongest materials ever used in a mammal's head. And Palaeoloxodon did its job. What else made its head important? It holds the key to knowing how different elephant species evolved. Some paleontologists thought Palaeoloxodon was closely related to modern Asian elephants when they first looked at its remains. But the way its head was built showed something different. The rounded top, bigger nose, and wider base of the tusks showed that they were from a much earlier time and were more primitive. But they were also much more advanced in terms of how they used their bodies. In fact, Palaeoloxodon's skull was so unusual that early reconstructions often got it wrong. For years, some museum illustrations depicted it with a flat, mammoth-like forehead. But as more fossils were found and studied, particularly in India, Japan, and Germany, the true shape came into focus. And what emerged was a creature that looked like a modern elephant, viewed through a warped lens of evolutionary experimentation. Even the way the skull connected with the spine was optimized for support. The occipital region, the back part of the skull, was widened to accommodate stronger neck muscles. This allowed the animal to raise and lower its head with precision, despite the enormous weight pulling it forward. That kind of stability would have been crucial in fights, feeding, and migration. The Palaeoloxodon head is a sign of something deeper. Evolution doesn't just favor size, it also favors form. Palaeoloxodon didn't need to be fast or sneaky to stay alive. It has to do with engineering. With such a well-built head, it turned into both a crown and a weapon, a structure that could hold the biggest tusks ever recorded, while still being light enough to be used in everyday life. And if the skull was the crown, then the tusks were the swords. Because Palaeoloxodon didn't just wear its weapons, it wielded them. Tusk weapons, nature's most underestimated killing tools. People often think of tusks as signs of beauty, intelligence, or old age. They are shaped like gentle giants' crescents and are made of ivory. The tusks of Palaeoloxodon namadicus, on the other hand, were very different. They were guns, powerful tools for staying alive. When they were over 4 meters long, they weren't just for show. They were part of one of the most dangerous toolkits any land animal had ever carried. To understand just how deadly these tusks could be, consider their scale. 4 meters is longer than a pickup truck. Each tusk could weigh several hundred pounds. But they weren't just long. They were thick, slightly curved, and projected forward, not downward like a modern elephant's. That angle is important. It meant Palaeoloxodon could thrust, not just swing. In a fight, those tusks acted like lances, designed to stab, skewer, and push with overwhelming force. In nature, form follows function, and in this case, the function was multi-purpose. The tusks were likely used in dominance displays, with males clashing in brutal tests of strength during mating season. Picture two 20-ton bulls facing off, heads lowered, tusks aligned, before charging in a slow-motion collision that sent ripples through the earth. These weren't the delicate jabs of fencing. These were body-sized battering rams in motion. The tusks were useful for more than just mating, though. They were also useful things. Like modern elephants, Palaeoloxodon may have used them to peel bark off of trees, dig for minerals in the ground, or knock over branches to get to leaves that were out of reach. With tusks longer than most dinosaurs, it had unmatched power and reach over its surroundings. It didn't need to go up. It did not need to jump. It did nothing but lean forward and let those tusks do the work. While adult Palaeoloxodons were nearly untouchable due to their size, the tusks gave them a lethal edge when challenged. Even a saber-toothed cat or giant hyena would have thought twice about getting too close. One sideways swing from a tusk that long could snap a predator's spine. One forward thrust could impale. There's no fossil record of Palaeoloxodon actively hunting, but if it needed to defend itself, it could become a tank with 2 spears mounted on its face. The musculature needed to control those tusks was enormous. The base of the tusk sat in massive sockets embedded in the skull, so deep and broad that they required a reinforced cranial dome just to stay anchored. These sockets connected to a dense network of facial and neck muscles, giving the elephant precise control over an enormous and deadly set of tools. What's even more interesting is how over time some tusks became uneven. In modern elephants, one tusk often becomes dominant, meaning it is used more often and wears down faster. This is likely what happened with Palaeoloxodon as well. Some people may have had a master tusk, which was longer, more bent, or smoother, from using it over and over again, whether for hunting, fighting, or getting through thick greenery. From a distance, Palaeoloxodon's tusks may have seemed majestic, but up close, they told a story of survival. They were tools honed by millions of years of evolution, shaped by competition, landscape, and need. These weren't ornamental, they were essential. They allowed the animal to reach, reshape, and rule its environment. And when challenged, they turned a peaceful browser into a formidable opponent no predator wanted to cross. But what good is power without a kingdom to rule? Let's look at the land this giant claimed, and how it left its mark across an entire continent. Asia's ancient supergiant, the world it ruled. Asia used to be home to giants before towns were built and borders were set up, before the Himalayas froze and deserts spread out. The biggest of them all was Palaeoloxodon namadicus, which lived in the Pleistocene. In the Cretaceous, Tyrannosaurus rex ruled the swamps of North America. In the same time period, Palaeoloxodon ruled the open fields, floodplains, and forests of ancient India and beyond. This wasn't some lonely colossus wandering an empty world. Palaeoloxodon thrived in a bustling Ice Age ecosystem, surrounded by other megafauna, massive buffalo-like bovids, towering giraffids, woolly rhinoceroses, and even ancient relatives of crocodiles and turtles. But none came close to its size, or its influence. Wherever it walked, the ground shifted. It wasn't just the biggest thing on the landscape, it was the landscape. Fossils of Palaeoloxodon have been found across the Indian subcontinent, particularly along the banks of the Narmada River, where it likely congregated with other megafauna near permanent water sources. This region would have been lush and seasonally flooded, with dense pockets of forest and wide, open meadows, perfect conditions for a 20-ton herbivore that needed to eat hundreds of pounds of vegetation each day. But Palaeoloxodon didn't stop in India. Fossils and close relatives have been found across Asia, from Pakistan and Nepal to Japan and Southeast Asia. It may have even roamed the steppes of Central Asia during cooler periods, following rivers and food sources as Ice Age climates fluctuated. This wide distribution tells us something important. This elephant was more than just big, it was adaptable. It could survive in semi-arid regions and humid forests alike. It moved with the seasons, tracking the monsoon's rhythm and using its intelligence, memory, and massive size to find food, evade seasonal droughts, and raise its young in safety. In many ways, it behaved much like modern elephants, but on a scale we can barely comprehend. The environment changed in more than one way because of it. Palaeoloxodon, like elephants today, probably played a keystone species role by cutting down trees, making paths through the forest, and clearing land for smaller animals to graze on. It spread seeds and made the dirt better as it went. Pets had to stay away from certain areas because of its sheer size. Its migration routes may have determined where whole groups of animals lived and did well. Palaeoloxodon shared its world with some of the most formidable Ice Age predators ever to exist. Saber-toothed cats prowled the tall grass. Packs of hyenas and wild dogs waited on the edges. Gigantic crocodilians lurked near water. And yet, no adult Palaeoloxodon had anything to fear. Its size made it functionally invulnerable, and when it moved in groups, it became a fortress on the move. What really makes its rule unique, though, is that it happened at the same time as the first people. Palaeoloxodon was probably seen by Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, and even early Homo humans in different parts of Asia. People from long ago probably followed groups, picked through the bodies of the dead, or even dared to hunt babies that were by themselves. But what about the adults? They were rocks that were alive. Around old fires, people may have told tales about giants with tusks the length of trees and movements that shook the earth. Palaeoloxodon's world was one of transition. Glaciers advanced and retreated. Rivers changed course. The continents continued their slow drift. And yet, for hundreds of thousands of years, this giant endured, thriving where others went extinct, migrating as needed, and towering above all other mammals in Asia. Its dominance wasn't loud or aggressive. It didn't roar or pounce. It simply walked, ate, moved, and lived, and in doing so, reshaped the very geography it walked upon. It was a true sovereign of the ancient world, its kingdom stretching from river valleys to mountaintop grasslands. Other top animals had short-lived dynasties, but Palaeoloxodon ruled for a very long time. There are many levels of silt and time that show that it has been there. Its bones are spread out over tens of thousands of kilometers. Not only was it a giant, it was also a European king or queen. Still, no ruler reigns unchallenged, so who dared to stalk a creature that cast a shadow across the savannah? The predator problem. What hunted a 22-ton elephant? Palaeoloxodon adults were not hunted by anything. Not only was this elephant big, it was also a natural defense. It was bigger than any animal in its range, standing over 5 meters tall and weighed more than 20 tons. That's more than 12 adult tigers put together. Its skin was probably about 2 to 3 inches thick. It had very big bones. What about its tusks? Longer than most Ice Age predators, and probably used as both club-like weapons and shields. A saber-toothed cat might have slashed at the leg of a mammoth or tried to ambush a young calf. But Palaeoloxodon adults? No predator in their right mind would pick that fight, not even in desperation. It wasn't worth the risk of a tusk through the ribcage or being crushed under thousands of pounds of trampling rage. That doesn't mean predators didn't try, but only under very specific conditions. Sick, elderly or isolated individuals could have been vulnerable, especially if they became separated from the herd. In these rare moments, apex predators like Homotherium, a scimitar-toothed cat, Crocuta ultima, a massive hyena species, or even giant Asian crocodilians might have attempted a kill. But even then, it would have been a dangerous gamble. More often, predators waited for calves. Young Palaeoloxodon, especially newborns, were significantly smaller, slower, and more vulnerable. But even this came with its own problem: the herd. Like elephants today, Palaeoloxodon probably lived in close-knit groups, especially with females and young animals. When these groups were ready to guard their young, they would stand in protective circles around them with their tusks out and their trunks raised. To get to the target, a hunter would have had to go around a wall of living tanks, which is a move that would have been very dangerous. It's no coincidence that Ice Age predators evolved to be opportunists. They scouted for weakness. They targeted the old, the injured, the unlucky. And even then, they probably focused on smaller prey. Facing a Palaeoloxodon meant risking death, and smart predators knew the math. Then there's the human side. Early Homo species may have eaten the dead or sick, but there is very little proof that people hunted adult Palaeoloxodon. Stone tools and cut lines from knives have been found on the bones of younger people. This suggests that ancient people either went after the weakest or most vulnerable people, or just picked through dead bodies whenever they could. Could early humans have banded together to take down a full-grown adult? Maybe. But it would have required an enormous coordinated effort, deadly tools, and incredible luck. Most likely, they followed herds, waiting for the occasional natural death, or a calf left behind in chaos. That alone could feed an entire tribe for weeks. Palaeoloxodon wasn't a hunter or a prey animal. It lived on the edge of the game. It moved where it wanted, ate when it needed to, and was big enough to avoid most risks. It was like a battleship in a sea of speedboats. Its defense wasn't fast or strong. It was immensity. And if size made it untouchable, how would it fare against the deadliest predator of all time? Let's take the fantasy fight to the field. Palaeoloxodon versus T-Rex. Speed versus mass. Would a T-Rex even win in a one-on-one fight? It's the biggest fight in ancient times. On one side is Tyrannosaurus rex, which was the wildest animal in North America in the late Cretaceous. Speed, bite force, and the urge to kill. On the other side, it is thought that Palaeoloxodon namadicus was the biggest land animal that ever lived. As tall as a T-Rex and with tusks that are longer than the animal itself, two great people from different times were never meant to meet. Who would win if they did? T-Rex stood about 12 feet tall at the hip, stretched up to 40 feet long, and weighed around 9 tons. It had powerful legs and could move at speeds up to 20-25 miles per hour. Its skull was over 5 feet long, and its bite force, measured at over 12,000 pounds, was one of the strongest in the history of life on Earth. It hunted ceratopsians and hadrosaurs, and even scavenged when it had to. T-Rex was a killer with purpose. Now enter Palaeoloxodon namadicus. Height at the shoulder, over 16 feet. Weight, more than 22 tons. It wasn't fast, probably clocking in at only a few miles per hour, but it didn't need speed. It had massive power, endurance, and near-impervious defense. So, in a one-on-one encounter, how would this unfold? The first advantage goes to T-Rex in terms of agility and offensive burst. It could cover ground quickly, maneuver around its prey, and deliver one of the most devastating bites of any land predator. If it could get behind the elephant and land a bone-crushing bite on the spine or hind leg, it could cause serious injury. However, Palaeoloxodon wasn't an easy target. Like elephants today, it probably was very smart, knew its surroundings well, and felt danger very strongly. It wouldn't turn around and run. Instead, it would stand straight up, squat, and bring its fangs forward. After that comes speed. If the T-Rex charged, Palaeoloxodon was able to hold itself up. If it charged back, the muscle turns into a wall that can't be stopped. It would take a long time for the tyrant lizard to hurt something that big, even if it bit it in the leg or neck. And time is not on your side when you're fighting close up with teeth. There's also the issue of stamina and defense. T-Rex was a pursuit predator with short bursts of energy. If the fight dragged on, or if the initial ambush failed, it could find itself on the defensive. Meanwhile, Palaeoloxodon, with its thick bones, wide stance and herd instincts if others were nearby, could hold the line indefinitely. Now, biomechanically, what would decide the fight? T-Rex's bite, while powerful, was localized. It had to get close, commit to an attack, and risk being gored or trampled. If it came to an open field battle with no ambush and no terrain advantage, Palaeoloxodon likely wins. It could absorb more damage, dish out more force, and had size that simply overwhelmed the physics of most predators. T-Rex may have killed dinosaurs, but none this massive, this fortified, this armed. Could T-Rex win? In a surprise attack maybe, but in a head-on duel? Most likely not. But even titans need backup. This was no solitary juggernaut. It was part of something much more powerful, a herd. Family fortress, herd tactics, and how they protected the young. If you're the biggest land animal that has ever lived, you might not think you need help. Palaeoloxodon namadicus didn't just care about size though, it also cared about family. These giants weren't just amazing when they were all together, they were almost impossible to touch. Modern elephants already show us how deeply social and protective their herds are. They live in matriarchal groups, with older females leading tightly bonded units made up of daughters, sisters, and calves. Males often leave the group when they mature, but the core herd remains strong, a living wall of instinct, experience, and defense. And paleontologists believe Palaeoloxodon behaved much the same way. Try to picture a group of these elephants, every adult over 6 feet tall, like ramming rams, if you will. Calves tucked in close to the middle. It's not just moving, they're traveling together, following the steps of families who came before them in search of water, food, and safety. The people in question weren't just huge. As a group, they made up a mobile fortress, whose goal was to protect the young. When predators appeared, saber-toothed cats, giant hyenas, early humans, the herd likely formed a protective circle, much like African elephants do today. Calves would be in the center, adults on the perimeter, tusks out, ears wide. No predator would get through easily. One charge from a defensive mother would be enough to shatter the ribs of anything daring enough to try. And even a coordinated pack would face a blinding wall of ivory and trampling feet. This defensive strategy likely lowered the mortality rate of young calves, giving the species a major evolutionary advantage. Even in a world full of megafaunal predators, Palaeoloxodon calves had one of the highest chances of surviving to adulthood, simply because of the family they were born into. But herd life wasn't just about protection. It was also about learning. Young elephants today mimic adult behavior: how to find food, how to interact, how to use their trunks. Palaeoloxodon calves would have done the same. Every journey was a classroom. Every migration is a lesson. The matriarch, the oldest female, would have carried generations of knowledge: where the water was, when the rains came, which paths were safe. She wasn't just a leader, she was the memory of the herd. And when drought struck or rivers dried, it was this shared wisdom that kept them alive. Unlike predators who relied on territory, elephants are masters of movement. They remember where they've been, and they pass it on. In a changing Ice Age landscape, that kind of intelligence was survival. Social bonding may have also helped reduce stress and increase resilience. Like modern elephants, Palaeoloxodon likely comforted one another, mourned their dead, and celebrated new births. Fossil sites with multiple individuals buried together suggest they may have died as a unit, perhaps in a drought, flood, or mass event, never abandoning each other, even in the end. It is important to remember that family security wasn't just a shield. It could also be used as a tool. When they were together, Palaeoloxodon wasn't just huge, they were also smart. A wolf pack could be wiped out by a charging herd. And because elephants can make deep rumbling sounds that humans can't hear, it's possible that these ancient giants organized their moves over long distances by calling to each other to warn, gather, or regroup. All of this paints a picture of an animal that survived not by running faster or fighting harder, but by standing together. They didn't just resist extinction by strength. They resisted it through loyalty, memory, and maternal ferocity. And perhaps that's the most terrifying part, for the predators anyway. You weren't just facing one animal. You were facing a herd with one mind and one purpose: protect the young at all costs. This, however, raises a deeper question. How did evolution create something so massive in the first place? And why did it keep getting bigger? Rise of the giants. Why did elephants evolve to be so massive? Size is important for life. That is the easy answer. But when you see a creature like Palaeoloxodon namadicus, with its 22-ton body mass, skyscraper shoulders, and tree-sized limbs, it's clear that this isn't just survival. This is evolution at its most extreme. That being said, what made elephants the largest land animals ever? What made it not only possible but also important to get really big? Palaeoloxodon evolved during the Pleistocene epoch, a time of fluctuating climates, expanding grasslands, and rapidly changing ecosystems. Forests gave way to wide-open savannas. Food sources spread out. Water became seasonal. In this new world, larger bodies meant more mobility and more endurance. Big herbivores could travel farther between feeding grounds and water sources. And when a creature had to consume hundreds of pounds of vegetation a day, it needed access to massive foraging territories. But size didn't just help Palaeoloxodon move. It helped it dominate. In open terrain, visibility was high and hiding wasn't an option. So Palaeoloxodon didn't hide. It stood its ground. As predators like saber-toothed cats, giant hyenas, and early humans evolved, they targeted the weak, the small, and the slow. So evolution selected for the opposite: the massive, the resilient, the untouchable. Being big also came with thermoregulatory benefits. Large animals lose heat more slowly, which is especially useful in cooler Ice Age climates. Their sheer bulk helped them endure colder nights and longer winters without needing to burrow, hibernate, or migrate as far as smaller species. In this sense, being huge was a natural insulation system. Then there's the issue of digestion. The digestive systems of large animals like elephants and sauropods are very long. This helps them break down tough, fibrous plant matter more quickly. The bigger the body and gut, the longer food can be broken down and the more nutrients can be taken. This method works only when there is enough space to carry all of its parts. It's slow, but efficient. Palaeoloxodon wasn't just big to carry a lot of weight. It had to be that size for its fuel system. It also had to do with social organization. The group worked better when it was bigger. People who were bigger could teach, protect, and lead. And in a place where problems like storms, animals, and changing landscapes were hard to predict, speed or stealth weren't the best ways to stay safe. There was a group of huge animals moving with purpose. They were all driven by the same natural force: get big or get eaten. There's also something called Cope's rule, an evolutionary hypothesis that states that species tend to increase in size over geological time. While not universal, it applies well to elephants and their ancestors. From smaller, tuskless proboscideans of the Miocene to the towering Palaeoloxodon, there's a clear trend. The bigger they got, the better they survived. Larger animals reproduce more slowly. They take longer to mature. They need more food, more space, and more stable conditions. This is part of why Palaeoloxodon eventually faded. As climate changed more rapidly and human activity increased, the balance tipped. What was once a strength, being gigantic, became a liability in a world too small, too warm, and too hunted. Although getting big has worked for a very long time, it protected them. It gave them the power to claim whole biomes as their own. and it left behind fossils that were so big that they had to be moved by cranes and viewed from above. Palaeoloxodon wasn't just big because of evolution, it was huge. This wasn't a fluke, it was the result of relentless selection: survive longer, travel farther, resist better. Nature didn't just create a big elephant, it created the most colossal land mammal to ever walk the earth, because every step forward in size made survival more likely. But evolution doesn't just build up, sometimes it shrinks. What happens when a titan gets stranded on an island? The island versions, when giants became dwarfs. It's not always evolution that gets bigger, it slams on the brakes sometimes, puts size in reverse, and makes something completely different. This is exactly what happened to Palaeoloxodon when it got stuck on islands like Crete, Malta, and Tylos. These weren't just slightly smaller versions of the huge creatures from the shore. It was a real tiny elephant. It used to be a 20-ton giant and was now about the size of a Great Dane. This strange phenomenon is called insular dwarfism, and it's one of evolution's most fascinating rules. When large animals get isolated on islands, cut off from predators, and forced to compete for limited resources, they often get smaller, much smaller. And for Palaeoloxodon, that transformation was extreme. Take Palaeoloxodon falconeri, for example, an island dwarf species discovered in Sicily and Malta. Adults of this species stood only about 1 meter tall at the shoulder. That's just over 3 feet, shorter than most 10-year-olds. We're talking about an elephant you could, hypothetically, pet without reaching up. This wasn't a juvenile. This was a full-grown adult, adapted to survive on islands where food was scarce and where predators either didn't exist or weren't big enough to matter. On the island of Crete, another variation appeared, Palaeoloxodon creticus, possibly even smaller than falconeri. Fragmentary fossils suggest some individuals may have weighed less than 300 kilograms, a fraction of their mainland ancestors. That means the world's smallest known elephant was smaller than some cows. But how did this happen? It's all about the lack of resources. Islands don't have a lot of room, food, or water. Most of the time, there is less conflict and less danger, but there is also less food for everyone. Smaller people have an edge in these kinds of places. They can have babies faster, need less food, and are better at moving around on rough ground. Over many generations, natural selection tends to favor small animals, and in a very short amount of time, a blink in the history of evolution, the giants change into something completely different. This process didn't just happen once, it happened repeatedly. Across the Mediterranean, different populations of Palaeoloxodon evolved into different dwarf forms, each shaped by its island's unique conditions. Some were slightly larger and retained longer tusks. Others were almost cartoonishly small, but all of them were descendants of titans, now adapted to miniature worlds. And it wasn't just their size that changed. Their proportions shifted too: shorter limbs, smaller skulls, and more compact bodies. These weren't scaled-down versions of mainland elephants. They were new creatures entirely, adapted for a life of squeezing through forests, navigating rocky slopes, and sipping from small springs instead of wide rivers. Despite their size, these dwarf elephants were still incredibly successful. Fossil evidence shows they thrived for thousands of years. Some species may have even survived into the early Holocene, possibly overlapping with the first human settlers of these islands. On Tylos, for instance, Palaeoloxodon remains have been dated to just 4,000 years ago, well within recorded human history. Imagine ancient sailors arriving on a remote Greek island and finding a group of strange soft elephants about the size of ponies. Their tusks are still there, and they walk with the ease of an ancient animal. It sounds like a story, but it's true. Evolution isn't about domination, it's about adaptation. Palaeoloxodon didn't always need to be massive to survive. On the mainland, size was power. On the islands, small was smart. And how did these giants and their tiny island cousins spread so far and wide across continents and oceans? Tectonic titans. How continental shifts helped them roam far and wide. Palaeoloxodon didn't stay in just one place. In the past, it wasn't tied to India or current national boundaries. This group of elephants lived all over the world. Their fossils, found in places like Europe, East Asia, and Africa, show that they didn't just survive in their environment, they moved with it. It was really a tectonic giant, meaning it was formed by and moved along with the Earth's surface. To understand how it pulled this off, we need to rewind to the Pleistocene epoch, a time when sea levels rose and fell like a yo-yo. Glaciers expanded and retreated in long pulses, sometimes locking away so much water that entire land bridges emerged between what we now think of as isolated regions. India connected more closely with mainland Asia. Europe and the British Isles were sometimes joined to the mainland. Even Africa and Eurasia were less separated than they are today. During glacial periods, when ice caps locked up ocean water, sea levels dropped by as much as 100 meters. In these windows of opportunity, massive herbivores could walk between continents, spreading slowly, steadily, but powerfully, like a rolling wave of tusks and thunderous footsteps. And Palaeoloxodon took full advantage of it. Fossils of different Palaeoloxodon species have been discovered across a vast range of regions. In India, the largest known species, P. namadicus, once dominated the open plains. In China and Japan, related species left behind skulls and tusks in caves and along ancient riverbeds. Remains found in Iran and the Levant point to a possible migration corridor through the Middle East. Across Europe, especially in Germany, Greece, Italy, and the Balkans, P. antiquus emerged as the leading elephant species of its time. Even in North Africa, fossil evidence suggests that early Palaeoloxodon herds may have overlapped with native African proboscideans. This vast distribution wasn't accidental. It was shaped by shifting climates and the layout of ancient continents, which allowed these massive herbivores to follow food, water, and favorable environments across enormous distances. As glaciers expanded, they trailed the warmth southward. When the ice retreated, they pushed into new territories, using the very contours of the land as natural highways. And wherever they went, they left a mark, not just in the earth, but on the ecosystems they transformed. Palaeoloxodon didn't just move, it reshaped ecosystems wherever it went. Its grazing and tree-felling behavior transformed forests into grasslands. It displaced or competed with other herbivores, like woolly mammoths in the north and straight-tusked elephants in the west. In some areas, its arrival marks major shifts in the fossil record, suggesting that entire communities had to adapt to the presence of a 20-ton newcomer. But its trip also shows something amazing. This group wasn't just one big, heavy family tree. It could be changed. Different species changed their size, shape of their skulls, the curves of their tusks, and how they behaved depending on what they needed to do. For instance, Palaeoloxodon antiquus lived in forests and specialized in them. This type of P. namadicus was made for open fields. Dwarfed island forms like P. falconeri developed from settlers from the mainland who got stuck. Geography and nature were used to make each version better. This adaptability, combined with access to vast migration corridors, allowed Palaeoloxodon to become one of the most widespread elephant lineages in history. Few land mammals, not even mammoths, can match its territorial range. But that range came with risks. When the last ice age ended and sea levels rose again, those bridges disappeared. Islands were cut off, populations were stranded, and humans, now smarter, better armed, and more numerous, expanded into those same regions. The walls of water rose, and the world that had once been a superhighway of giants slowly turned into a maze of extinction traps. Palaeoloxodon didn't just live on one land for a lot of its time in power, though. It walked on three, leaving behind bones that show loud movements, old footprints on dry seabeds, and an animal that moved with the earth. Of course, Palaeoloxodon wasn't the only ancient elephant stomping across the Ice Age. So how did it compare to its more famous cousin? Versus mammoths. What made Palaeoloxodon so different? Most people think of mammoths when they think of Ice Age elephants. These are big, hairy animals with curled tusks and thick coats that walk through the snow. Mammoths are in movies, on display in museums, and even in attempts to bring them back to life. Palaeoloxodon, on the other hand, was a bigger and more interesting old elephant that lived with them, but stayed out of sight. What was the difference between this long-lost giant and the most famous elephantid in the world? First, the size. While mammoths like Mammuthus primigenius, the woolly mammoth, were large, standing about 9 to 11 feet tall at the shoulder and weighing 6 to 8 tons, Palaeoloxodon namadicus blew past those numbers. It reached over 16 feet at the shoulder and could weigh more than 22 tons, making it not just bigger than mammoths, but possibly the largest land mammal of all time. Mammoths may have been impressive, but next to Palaeoloxodon, they were underdogs. Then comes the skull structure, one of the most dramatic differences. Mammoths had a high domed skull with a steep forehead and long nasal opening for their trunk. Palaeoloxodon's skull was an entirely different beast. It featured a thickened, reinforced dome on top, especially prominent in males, which may have been used for headbutting behavior. It gave their skulls a blocky, wide appearance that could support much longer and heavier tusks. If the mammoth's head was a trumpet, Palaeoloxodon's was a battering ram. When it comes to tusks, both species had long, curved ivory weapons, but Palaeoloxodon's could be over 4 meters, 13 feet long, were often straighter, and were heavier than mammoth's tusks that were tightly curled. These tusks were used for defense, digging, and pulling bark. But Palaeoloxodon's tusks were the most useful because they were so big and stuck out. We could see a huge swing. The Palaeoloxodon could stab. Another key distinction lies in climate and habitat. Mammoths were mostly adapted to cold environments. The woolly mammoth, for example, had a thick coat, small ears, a compact body, and a specialized fat layer to withstand freezing temperatures. They roamed tundras, steppe environments, and glacier edges. Palaeoloxodon, on the other hand, was a child of warmth. It preferred open woodlands, grasslands, and semi-tropical savannas. It didn't need fur. It was born to move through heat, dust, and seasonal monsoons. This also caused changes in behavior. Mammoths often moved when glaciers moved forward or backward. They traveled hundreds of miles every year as close-knit families. Palaeoloxodon probably did the same thing, but on different types of land. It traveled from India to Europe along old river systems and huge fields. Its range was limited not by ice, but by the amount of water and food it could find. Another often overlooked contrast, their evolutionary roots. Mammoths belong to the Elephantidae family, which also includes modern elephants. Palaeoloxodon, while sometimes classified within Elephantidae, is often placed in a closely related branch and may have split from the Asian elephant lineage. In fact, the modern Asian elephant, Elephas maximus, is considered more closely related to Palaeoloxodon than to mammoths, meaning today's gentle giants may carry more reaper elephant DNA than we realize. Culturally and scientifically, mammoths have enjoyed the limelight. Their frozen remains, complete with skin, hair, and sometimes even stomach contents, have given scientists a wealth of information. Meanwhile, Palaeoloxodon's fossils are scarcer and often fragmentary, found mostly in Asia and southern Europe. This lack of pristine specimens has kept it out of the public imagination, despite being far more massive and ecologically dominant in many regions. But when you put them next to each other, it's clear. Mammoths were built to survive, while Palaeoloxodon was built to be the best. It was bigger and stronger, and its head was made for battle. Its tusks could move trees or enemies. But even giants have limits. So what finally brought the biggest land mammal in history to its knees? Death of a giant. What finally killed off Palaeoloxodon? Palaeoloxodon namadicus was the king of all land animals for at least 100,000 years. It stepped on trees and crushed them, but it wasn't hurt by animals, and each step changed habitats. But big animals have their limits too. Even the reaper elephant, which was the biggest land animal that had ever lived, fell in the end. However, the short answer is people and the environment. Let's start with the change in the climate shift. Over the course of the late Pleistocene, Earth's temperature became very unstable. It took waves of glaciers to go away and return. Every time the ice moved forward, the landscape changed a lot. Grasslands went into forests, rivers moved, and plant patterns fell apart and then came back together again. Large animals like Palaeoloxodon were hit hard because they needed a lot of food and a safe environment to stay alive. Suddenly, their massive size, which had been their greatest advantage, became a liability. As food sources dwindled or moved, the elephants had to range farther and farther to sustain themselves. But longer migrations through fragmented habitats made calves more vulnerable, herds more scattered, and reproduction more difficult. A creature designed to dominate open plains was now surrounded by uncertainty, competing with other grazers and adapting too slowly to keep up. And then came Homo sapiens. Modern humans began spreading across Asia around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. They didn't arrive as a trickle, they came with tools, fire, and teamwork. For the first time in Palaeoloxodon's reign, it faced a predator that could think, plan, and share knowledge across generations. There's strong evidence that early humans encountered Palaeoloxodon: butchery marks on bones, stone tools near carcasses, ancient kill sites. While taking down a full-grown adult was probably rare and incredibly dangerous. Juveniles and weakened individuals were tempting targets. And more importantly, humans began doing something predators never had: changing the landscape. With controlled fire, humans cleared forests to create grassland hunting zones. They disrupted migratory routes, hunted multiple prey species to exhaustion, and forced large herbivores into tighter and more dangerous pockets. Palaeoloxodon's massive size, which had once allowed it to ignore predators, now made it a slow-moving target in a rapidly changing world. Also, don't forget about the push to have children. Massive mammals have slow birth rates. Because they have to depend on safe social systems a lot and have babies that take a long time to grow, populations can't quickly recover from decline. Palaeoloxodon herds couldn't get enough new members to replace the ones that died off because of climate change and more people. By around 30,000 years ago, most mainland Palaeoloxodon species had vanished. Some island dwarf descendants, like those on Tylos, may have lingered into the Holocene, perhaps as recently as 4,000 to 6,000 years ago, placing them alongside early human civilizations. But the age of the giants was ending. In the end, it wasn't just one event that killed the Reaper elephant. It was a convergence of pressures: cooling climate, rising seas, human expansion, and habitat fragmentation. These forces didn't just eliminate one species, they tore through entire ecosystems. Palaeoloxodon just happened to be the biggest loss. Its extinction reminds us of a sobering truth: no creature is too large to fail. Dominance doesn't guarantee survival. In fact, the very traits that make a species successful in one epoch can become the weight that drags it down in the next. And when it faced extinction, it wasn't just from nature's wrath, it was from us. What really happened when early humans came face to face with the Reaper elephant? Coexistence with humans. Were they worshipped, feared, or hunted? People used to stand on grassy fields and look up at living mountains long before there were buildings, satellites, or written words. They saw Palaeoloxodon namadicus, which was tall, had tusks, and was hard to miss. This elephant was more than just an animal. It was over 16 feet tall and weighed more than 22 tons. For the first people who lived there, it was a living god, a wall of life that moved, and a task that was both scary and amazing. So how did humans and Palaeoloxodon interact? Were they enemies, co-inhabitants? Or did early people stand in silent reverence, watching giants move through a world they shared? The fossil record gives us fragments of an answer. At several Palaeoloxodon fossil sites across Asia and Europe, archaeologists have found stone tools, cut marks on bones, and signs of butchery. These weren't accidents. The marks suggest that early humans, perhaps Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, and later Homo sapiens, deliberately butchered Palaeoloxodon carcasses, removing meat, marrow, and fat. In some cases, tools were found directly alongside the remains, embedded in sediment layers dating back tens of thousands of years. But this doesn't always mean that people went after them directly. A lot of these interactions were probably just looking for food when the chance came up. It wasn't just hard to kill a fully grown Palaeoloxodon. It was almost suicide to try. Most of the time, people probably found animals that had died naturally, or babies that had been split from their mothers and moved in to eat what they could. A single Palaeoloxodon body could have provided food for a whole group for several weeks, including meat, fat, hide, and tools made from bone. Still, we can't rule out active hunting, especially of the young. Organized human groups were smart, strategic, and adaptable. Using fire, terrain, and teamwork, it's possible that small herds could be ambushed, funneled into traps, or driven toward cliffs. Modern-day elephant hunts in some tribal cultures still require multiple people, coordinated tactics, and extensive preparation, skills our Ice Age ancestors likely possessed. There's also the question of spiritual significance. To early humans, size meant something. Animals that loomed over them, that moved slowly and with power, were often elevated in myth and ritual. While we lack written records from this era, the cave art, bone carvings, and burial sites from later periods suggest that mammoths and other large animals were often depicted with reverence. It's possible Palaeoloxodon played a similar role. Did we worry about them? Of course. If there were a group of 20-ton elephants going through the brush, they could not be stopped. A group of people could be crushed in seconds if someone made the wrong move. Fear may have turned into admiration, though, as people came to understand that these were not just animals, but also natural forces. Modern elephants pass down knowledge through generations. They mourn their dead. They remember trails, water sources, and distant locations for decades. Early human communities, growing increasingly intelligent and socially complex, may have observed and learned from these massive animals, how they moved, how they communicated, and how they survived. In this sense, Palaeoloxodon wasn't just a creature to fear or hunt. It was a teacher, a presence that shaped human behavior through sheer scale and mystery. Some of the first stories ever told around glowing fires under open skies may have been about giants. This is a scary thought, not scary things, not as easy to catch, but as stories about people who lived on Earth. There were stories about huge beings that moved like thunder, tore down trees, and then disappeared without a sound. But Palaeoloxodon didn't just share the land, it shaped it, and its absence left behind more than silence. Palaeoloxodon's ecological impact, bulldozers of the Ice Age. It's no longer just an animal if it moves enough dirt, bends enough trees, and clears enough room. It turns into a natural force. That's what Palaeoloxodon namadicus was when it ruled Asia during the Ice Age. It wasn't just a dormant herbivore that ate plants. It was a bulldozer of the ancient world and a designer of the environment. Modern elephants are already known for their landscape-shaping behavior. They tear down trees, dig for water, trample paths into the soil, and spread seeds across vast territories. Now imagine that, but scaled up to a creature twice the size of an African elephant, with tusks longer than pickup trucks and a body that could flatten forests with a casual shoulder nudge. Palaeoloxodon's impact on the environment was profound. It likely created grasslands where forests once stood, simply by pushing through thickets, knocking over saplings, and foraging for bark. These open clearings allowed sunlight in, giving rise to new plant communities and changing the structure of the land. Wherever it roamed, it didn't just eat, it rearranged the map. Palaeoloxodon's tusks weren't just weapons or ornaments, they were powerful, multi-purpose tools. These ancient giants likely used them to strip bark from trees, slowly clearing out old growth and making way for new life. In times of drought, they could dig deep into dry riverbeds to access hidden groundwater, creating life-saving waterholes for smaller animals. And with a single push, they could topple massive branches or even entire trees, bringing nutrient-rich leaves crashing down for themselves and others to feast on. But these actions did more than just ensure their own survival. They reshaped the environment. Fallen trees became shelter for birds. Fresh openings in the forest welcomed sunlight and new growth. Their movements churned the soil like a plow, helping vegetation regenerate. Palaeoloxodon wasn't just part of its ecosystem, it was an architect of it, a living, breathing gardener that sculpted the landscape with every step and sweep of its tusks. It also played a massive role in seed dispersal. With a diet that likely included a wide variety of plants, Palaeoloxodon would have swallowed seeds whole and passed them dozens of miles away in nutrient-rich dung. That meant trees and shrubs could spread far beyond their point of origin, repopulating clearings, riverbanks, and floodplains thanks to the stomach of a giant. A 22-ton animal produces a lot of waste. Each dropping would have been a mini ecosystem of its own, feeding dung beetles, fertilizing soil, and drawing in grazers. It was part of a cycle that enriched the very ground Palaeoloxodon walked on. The trails it carved over generations would have shaped migration routes not just for itself, but for countless other animals. Water buffalo, deer, rhinoceroses, and even early humans may have followed in its footsteps, quite literally. The paths to water, shade, and seasonal food that it cleared became lifelines for everything else. The effect didn't stop when a Palaeoloxodon died. A body that big would be a big deal. Hyenas, ravens, wolves, and even saber-toothed cats would eat it for weeks. Its bones would be chewed on by smaller animals to get iron. As the body breaks down, it returns important nutrients to the earth. In the spring, that spot will be full of new life. In short, Palaeoloxodon was more than just a consumer of its world. It was a creator of ecosystems, a living tractor that tilled the land, distributed life, and reset the clock on every patch of ground it touched. Its loss was more than just the loss of one species. It was the loss of a natural process. When the bulldozer went away, woods got denser, patterns of plant succession changed, and smaller animals lost their ecological partner. The land remembered when the reaper elephant was gone. If we want to understand what we lost, we have to start with what we've found. Massive bones, mysterious skulls, and fossils that defy belief. Fossils of mystery, the best specimens ever found. A few big bones, jaw pieces, and a tusk here and there were all that were known about Palaeoloxodon namadicus for many years. Scientists knew it had been there. They knew it was big, but the whole picture, that wasn't there. Paleontologists had to rethink what land animals were capable of when they finally saw what they had found. It was so huge, had such strange structures, and was so different from what they had expected. Let's begin with the Narmada Valley, India, a fossil gold mine where some of the most significant Palaeoloxodon bones have been unearthed. This area, shaped by rivers and seasonal flooding for thousands of years, became a natural graveyard for megafauna. Here, researchers found an enormous femur, thick, curved, and longer than the average adult human is tall. That single bone alone hinted at a creature far larger than the woolly mammoths of the north. And when more bones began to appear, pelvic fragments, pieces of skull, parts of ribs, they confirmed the unimaginable. This was not just another prehistoric elephant. This was a land mammal that rivaled small sauropods. One of the most jaw-dropping finds was a nearly complete skull discovered in Japan. Not from P. namadicus, but from a close relative, it revealed the defining feature of the genus. That strange, thickened cranial dome, reinforced at the top like a helmet. The bones of the crest were not just thick, they were densely packed, likely evolved for combat, weight distribution, or both. This skull, preserved with remarkable clarity, showed the entire nasal passage, tusk sockets, and jaw structure, allowing researchers to reconstruct not just how the animal looked, but how it functioned. In Europe, particularly in Germany, Italy, and Greece, bones of another relative, Palaeoloxodon antiquus, have been discovered in almost complete form. In some locations, entire skeletons were found lying flat across ancient lake beds, spines still connected, tusks intact, leg bones arranged like they had only just fallen. These discoveries have given paleontologists a much clearer look at the genus's body proportions, movement, and potential herd behavior. They even found footprints in some places, massive round impressions pressed into once soft sediment, now solidified into rock. Those tracks are millions of years old, yet still show the shuffle and stride of a creature that shook the ground. On the other hand, the islands in the Mediterranean produced some of the weirdest Palaeoloxodon fossils, which were small versions of the huge animal. Scientists found heads in caves on Crete, Malta, and Sicily that were so small they could fit in a backpack. These were island dwarf species like P. falconeri and P. creticus, which had changed over time to be able to live in places with few supplies and no enemies. One head was only 30 centimeters long, which is only a quarter of the length of a normal Palaeoloxodon skull. Still, the shape was clear. The same big roof, the same shape of tusks. The same old family tree. Scientists were able to show that the same process that made giants could also make tiny survivors. In Crete, one cave even preserved an entire family group of dwarf elephants, their bones layered together in the same sediment layer. It's a haunting reminder that these weren't just isolated animals. They were part of living, breathing herds that echoed their giant ancestors in miniature. Every fossil tells a story, but with Palaeoloxodon, each discovery is a revelation. From the mammoth bones of the subcontinent to the backpack-sized skulls of the islands, the genus has become one of the most versatile, far-reaching, and morphologically extreme elephant lineages ever discovered. And yet, even today, many of its bones remain unstudied. Museums in India, Europe, and Japan hold dusty drawers of unidentified proboscidean fossils, some of which may belong to P. namadicus. Every new excavation carries the potential to uncover another piece of the puzzle, a bigger tusk, a broader skull, or a more complete skeleton that may finally let us stand face to face with the full majesty of this lost giant. And when the bones are this big, how did the animal they belong to even move? The answer is stranger and more brilliant than you'd think. Biomechanics of a beast. How did it even walk? Palaeoloxodon namadicus was not only the biggest elephant, it weighed over 22 tons and stood 16 feet tall at the shoulder. It was the largest land animal that had ever been seen. How in the world did something that big move? How did it walk or stand without breaking its bones in half? The answer lies in a blend of biomechanical genius and evolutionary precision, the kind that only nature can fine-tune over millions of years. Palaeoloxodon's entire skeleton was an engineering masterpiece, not built for speed, but for strength, stability, and sheer endurance. The legs of Palaeoloxodon weren't shaped like the angled, flexing limbs of predators. They were columnar, like the vertical pillars of a cathedral. This design, straight and weight-bearing, meant the bones transferred the animal's massive weight directly down into the ground, rather than distributing it across joints that might buckle. Think of them less like knees and more like solid marble columns. The upper bones, femurs and humeri, were especially thick, designed to withstand constant downward force. The feet were also unique. Like modern elephants, Palaeoloxodon likely walked on the tips of its toes, with a thick fatty pad beneath each foot acting as a shock absorber. This cushioned sole allowed the beast to move across rough terrain without cracking bones or tearing ligaments. Even at 22 tons, its steps would have been surprisingly quiet, thudding, not crashing. A slow, heavy rhythm like distant drums rolling across the earth. And then there's the spine. Supporting a body this enormous meant that the spinal column had to do more than just link the head and tail. It had to act as a bridge, strong, flexible, and able to carry the weight of the chest, belly, and tusks without sagging or snapping. The vertebrae of Palaeoloxodon were enlarged, heavily reinforced, and deeply interlocked, offering both strength and mobility. Ligaments and tendons attached to the spine likely created a natural suspension system, helping distribute tension evenly with each step. The shoulders and hips were widened, massive plates of bone braced with thick muscle attachments. These areas bore the most dynamic forces, lifting the front of the body during rearing, stabilizing sideways shifts, and absorbing the impact of forward momentum. The wide gait would have made turning slow, but incredibly stable. Palaeoloxodon didn't pivot. It rolled like a freight train, unshakable once in motion. Let's talk about the head and neck, which are their own physical puzzle. Palaeoloxodon's head was huge and weighed hundreds of kilos. It held tusks that were more than 4 meters long, weighed several hundred pounds each, and were very strong. With that much weight in front of it, the animal should have been top-heavy and off-balance, but evolution made up for it. The skull was built with air pockets in the bone, reducing weight without compromising strength. The thick dome-like forehead wasn't just for looks or combat. It helped distribute the stress of carrying the tusks, while anchoring the massive neck muscles required to move and stabilize them. This complex design lets the elephant lift, lower, and swing its head with precision, not brute force. Even its pace was biomechanically sound. Like modern elephants, Palaeoloxodon likely had a unique gait, always keeping at least 2 feet on the ground at any time, with no airborne phase like in running mammals. This 4-beat walk minimized stress on joints, reduced impact shock, and allowed it to move slowly and steadily for long periods. It may have only covered a few kilometers per hour, but it could walk for hours without tiring or overheating. The final layer, thermoregulation. With a surface area that large, overheating was a serious risk. Palaeoloxodon likely used ear flapping, if its ears were large enough, as well as heat dumping through its skin, and possibly even trunk spraying water or dust to cool down. But what if that same brilliance led evolution to go the opposite direction? From 20 tons to barely 300 kilograms, this is the smallest elephant you'll ever meet. The dwarf of Crete, the world's smallest elephant. Palaeoloxodon went from being huge on land to being so small it could barely look someone in the eye. The island of Crete was the most strange stop on its strange evolutionary trip. That's where Palaeoloxodon creticus, one of the world's smallest elephants, was born. It lived in an area surrounded by water and free of any animals that could eat it. Standing just 1 meter tall at the shoulder, around 3 feet, this species was shorter than most kitchen countertops. Fully grown adults were barely the size of a large dog. Its weight? An estimated 250 to 350 kilograms, or less than 1/60th the mass of its mainland cousin, P. namadicus. And yet, in its bones, its skull, and the shape of its tusks, you could still see the lineage of a giant. Evolution had simply scaled it down to fit a new world. The discovery of P. creticus sent shockwaves through paleontology, not just because of its size, but because of what it proved. Insular dwarfism, once considered a fringe idea, now had undeniable evidence. The same genus that gave us 22-ton land titans had, under the right pressures, evolved into an animal smaller than a Shetland pony. The reason it shrunk so much is unknown. Island life is the way. During the Pleistocene, Crete was its own world. There were no big animals to worry about, not much to eat, and not much space to move around. Being big was no longer helpful for life in this kind of setting. In fact, it was a headache. A huge elephant would get hungry very quickly. But a little one? That could do well. Over thousands of years, natural selection favored smaller individuals, those who ate less, moved efficiently, and could reproduce more reliably in a resource-scarce setting. Over time, each generation became a little more compact, a little more suited to island life, until the result was P. creticus, a miniaturized miracle of adaptation. Its skull was proportionally similar to its ancestors, but downsized in every dimension. It still had the iconic Palaeoloxodon dome, a thickened raised section on the top of the head, but reduced and rounded. Its tusks, though far shorter, retained the gentle forward sweep seen in its larger cousins. The legs were shorter and stockier, perfect for maneuvering through rocky, uneven terrain. Fossils of P. creticus were discovered in limestone caves on the island, often buried alongside bones of other strange island-adapted creatures, like giant rodents and massive flightless birds. One cave yielded a nearly complete skeleton, allowing scientists to reconstruct the creature with astonishing detail. The result? A perfectly proportioned elephant that looked like it had stepped out of a fantasy novel. And while its size might seem amusing today, P. creticus was a true survivor. It adapted to a hostile, isolated world and carved out a niche where no other elephant could follow. Some evidence even suggests it may have persisted into the Holocene, possibly as recently as 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, overlapping with early human settlers on the island. Imagine the myths such creatures could have inspired. Tiny elephants hiding in forests, remnants of a forgotten race of giants. Some people think that the big nasal opening in the fossil heads of dwarf elephants like P. creticus, where the trunk would have connected, may have been the inspiration for the Cyclops stories in Greek mythology. People in the past who didn't know much about anatomy might have thought that a round head with a hole in the middle looked like the face of a monster with only one eye. So how did we forget a creature that once ruled 3 continents? And why is it finally time to remember? Why we forgot this giant and why we shouldn't have. We remember the great ancient stars like the Tyrannosaurus rex, the woolly mammoth, and the saber-toothed cat in the Great Prehistoric Hall of Fame. It's possible to find these monsters in books, toys, and movies. But most people have forgotten about Palaeoloxodon namadicus, which was the biggest land animal that ever lived. It's not in any blockbusters. There isn't a museum mechanical that looks like it. Still, it should be able to stand shoulder to shoulder with the greats. Why did we forget then? One big reason is that it's easy to see. In contrast to mammoths, whose fossils were found frozen in permafrost with their hair, skin, and even innards still whole, Palaeoloxodon fossils are generally broken up, spread out, and buried deep in sediments in India and some parts of Asia. Many of its pieces weren't given the attention they deserved until the last few decades, and they were often mislabeled or ignored. The largest bones, the ones that show how big it really was, are hard to find, and scientists didn't have enough information for years. After that, there's geography. A lot of the study and inspiration in paleontology has long been focused on North America and Europe, home of mammoths, cave bears, and other Ice Age animals. Palaeoloxodon was a giant in Asia that lived in places that didn't get as much attention from scientists or the media. Its story was buried in dirt and in the wrong place. Also, it wasn't flashy in the traditional sense. It didn't have saber teeth, it didn't fly, it didn't hunt, it didn't even roar. It walked, ate, and moved continents with its presence. And in a world obsessed with killers and claws, quiet dominators like Palaeoloxodon often get sidelined. It could be that we have forgotten to include gentle giants who changed the world by living in it instead of killing it. This could be the biggest societal reason. Palaeoloxodon did not eat other animals. It was a planet builder, a tree climber, a person who makes trails. It moved like a storm but took care of things like a gardener. It went extinct without a fuss. It was a quiet removal. And that's the reason we need to remember. Palaeoloxodon namadicus tells a story we need more than ever. A story about scale, balance, and how even giants can vanish when the earth shifts beneath them. It forces us to reckon with how little we truly know about the champions of the past, and how easily we lose track of the most extraordinary lives when we don't look outside the spotlight. It also reminds us that science is still unfolding. Only recently have researchers begun piecing together its full stature from fragments in India and Japan. Every new fossil, every revised estimate, pushes the boundary of what we thought was possible for mammals. This is a creature that broke the rules and then got left out of the book entirely. But no longer. Palaeoloxodon's time isn't just a part of Earth's past, it's a warning. This means that even the strongest people can leave without a trace. Even though we don't remember, the Earth does. That it's never too late to give a lost crown back to the true king. So the next time someone asks what the biggest dinosaur was, surprise them. Say, actually, I'll tell you about the biggest thing that came after the dinosaurs. a creature bigger than any mammoth, with tusks like spears and bones like bridges. Scientists haven't learned much about Palaeoloxodon, even though it may have been the world's biggest land animal. Even though it didn't roar or hunt, every step it took changed the Ice Age world. It's time for it to get back in the spotlight, next to the giants we admire and fear. If you think this huge animal should get more attention, please like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments if you think a T-Rex could beat the Reaper elephant of India, because the most scary giants are sometimes the ones we forget about.